Yeah,
I'm not trying to dodge. It was a way in which this stuff was phrased that was bothersome to me.
that's
I
okay.
think
Yeah.
I think I know at a rudimentary level some of the things that we need to do to move us beyond capitalism. In other words, some of the economic changes that have to take place in order to have a better society. People have to have access to what they need to make a living. We can't have money, okay? We can't have people who have to work for other people. If we're going to have a modern society, we have to have some degree of overall coordination, because we get parts from here and there, and you can't produce unless we're all coordinated. So there are some things that I do know, but can I, say here is the one solution? No, but I can give general ideas.
Right. The general ideas, I think, is all that we're really asking, right? Because it just helps people understand the direction you're talking about, and it goes from being way too abstract and vague for people to even know what you're saying to something they can kind of get their head around. And I understand maybe the concern is people are going to try and peg you to one thing you say and make you defend that. And if you fail, then they want you to throw everything out the window or something like that.
Okay, let me make it very, very simple. We need, in a sense, to return to the situation that existed in England prior to the start of capitalism, where the vast majority of people had their own property and means of production. They were able to have resources to make a living for themselves without people dictating to them what they must do or else starve. Okay, so what we need is to return to a situation in which Marx called individual property, whether that property is held in privately or collectively. It could be something one way, some could be one way, some could be another way. It's a secondary issue. But we live in a society in which the vast majority of people have no individual property. We have to move away from that. And it's not really a question of property. It's having the means to live without other people being able to dominate you and tell you what you have to do. Okay? So, that's already saying something. It's not, just abstract. But then you get into what is needed to have and maintain, reproduce from day to day a society that is like this. Well, you can't operate according to capitalist principles where some people amass things that they hold, just for themselves away from everybody else, and because that's, again, preventing other people from having it. So, you got to get rid of production that is driven by an individual profit motive. And we have to produce, according to some way in which we're meeting our own and other people's needs. You can't have accumulation of money, which is the same thing. So there are certain consequences of trying to ensure that a society like the kind that I'm proposing would work. Is it a plan? No. I don't really care about any particular plan versus another. What I care about is the general principle and trying to operationalize the general principle.
Right, yeah. I don't think it's necessary to talk about a specific plan. Well,
I know you weren't saying that. I just wanted to make that clear. Yeah.
Yeah. And so one question that comes to my mind is, so obviously we don't live in a society of peasants anymore, so it would have to look the way people have property and run their own business, if that is even the right terminology, it would look a lot different.
Probably. We could decide we want to go back to an agrarian lifestyle. That's a possibility, and I don't think it should be taken off the table necessarily. It's not what I would choose, but I'm an old guy. I'm not going to live much longer, so. But yeah, if we decide that we want to live in a highly integrated, global society, that tells us that we need a good deal of economic coordination, and it tells us that we can't just leave all kinds of economic decisions up to individuals. You leave economic decisions just up to individuals when those decisions affect billions of other people, like all of the issues regarding the climate crisis, and it leads to disaster.
What do you think of like a Bernie Sanders style social democracy?
Been there, done that. I mean, social democracy has failed everywhere. And why does it? I mean, just as an historical, it's just an historical fact. It was tried and tried and tried again, and there was a movement away from it because of its failures. You know, I'm thinking of such things as like Keynesian fine tuning, you know, in the 1960s as well. You know, a kind of regulated capitalist economy that was tried and failed. And the reason it fails fundamentally is that capitalism does not really take kindly. It's a system, but the laws of capitalism come to dominate over attempts to hem them in. Okay, you can do some things to try to ameliorate the situation, but they always have consequences, and the consequences are often worse than what you began with. So, I mean, it's not exactly a matter of social democracy, but I mean, look, for instance, at antitrust legislation meant to break up the monopolies. That was tried about a century ago, a little bit more. What we have now is worse. The underlying dynamic of capitalism is the quest for profit. And I wish Andrea were here because I would want to give her an opportunity to respond. But I think that the fundamental dynamic is the opposite of what she's saying. The fundamental dynamic is bigger and fewer large firms. The big fish gobble up the small fish. And that monopolization is the dynamic of the system, rather than a flourishing of all kinds of small opportunities. And the reason for that goes straight back to the profit motive. It has to do with what's called economies of scale, economies of large scale production and other large scale things. It's cheaper and more efficient to be big. And so the big entities are more efficient, they operate more cheaply, they can sell at a lower price than the small entities. And so they drive out the smaller entities. And so it just comes back to basic capitalist efficiency produces the opposite of free capitalist competition, which is, you know, capitalist monopolization.
But
so it's really very, very hard to beat this dynamic. And you can see this in take the Medicare for all in the United States. Why do we not have it? It's because of the big insurance companies that are blocking it, and so forth and so on. And so that's just a question of feasibility in terms of raw political power. It becomes hard to do anything.
But you would be for such a system if it could go through.
Sure, but the problem is you get these things and they do happen, and then they get corrupted, and they don't work out like they were intended to do. I mean, there are big problems, but yeah, I mean, I think it would be better if most of us had medical care that wasn't subject to restrictions for pre-existing conditions and so forth and so on. But I'm not saying anything different than most people, but I think that we really need a very radical change in society, a society operating on different principles rather than trying to tweak changes, to tweak the existing system to make some marginal changes. I mean, the fact of the matter is, people who have money don't want to pay for other people's health care. So this kind of thing is always going to be in danger.
Right, yeah. So, and I can kind of anticipate that same criticism, but since we still have like a general trend of creating more wealth in the world, even if it is concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, why not at some point in the future, do you think it would be feasible to look at something like universal basic income as kind of like a fundamental part of the system? And like at some point, does it make sense to move away from a system where everyone works? I know that's kind of like we're talking about the future now, and it's not necessarily practical, but
I've never said move away from a system in which everybody works.
No, I know. I'm asking.
Right. Okay. I'm talking about people being forced to work for other people.
Right.
I mean, either universal basic income is very, very, very basic, very minimal, or it's going to come up against the major problem of capitalism, which is capitalism is a system in which people are compelled under threat of starvation to do the bidding of other people. Okay, if people have enough income to avoid that, I can assure you they will avoid that. And capitalism will just come crashing down. And then when it comes crashing down, where do you get the basic income to provide? And the people who propose universal basic income are actually aware of this. They're well aware of this. But if you want, because that hasn't been tried and happened, but I remember back when early retirement was being proposed for people in some unions, and they expected a few people to, a few percentage points of people to retire at age 60 rather than age 65, and it was massive. Okay, people would rather not to have to do the bidding of other people. And so you give them the way not to do it, they often take it. And this is, another example is if you look at a country like Italy, which has a big employment problem, but it has traditionally funded graduate study. So if you don't have a job, you just become a graduate student. You have people who live their whole lives as graduate students. They don't live very well, but they get a stipend and they don't have to go search for work to work for other people. People really don't like to do that. So I think universal basic income, it sounds good, but if it were really to be provided, it would threaten the existence of capitalism.
Well, it isn't the assumption that automation would kind of take the place of where people are, and so it wouldn't collapse because enough is automated, and then
I mean, the way I understand it is the proponents of universal basic income say we're going to need it because jobs are being eliminated and we can't sustain ourselves this way. Wherein the only way to get income is to work. Is that how you understand it?
Yeah.
Yeah. My basic problem with that is, although there is some truth to it, I mean, automation definitely does eliminate jobs. We've had hundreds of years of automation, and it is not the case that an ever decreasing share of the population is employed. Okay? And the reason is certain jobs go away, but certain new jobs get created. And people work more in various kinds of services and less in manufacturing and agriculture. So I don't think that there's some inevitable trend where there are going to be less opportunities to have jobs.
Right. Yeah, I think that's true, except if you believe something like human level artificial intelligence will be reached at some point. But that's I guess hypothetical.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I think all we can do is speculate.
Right. Okay. Uh, well, we might wrap it up there unless there's something else you want to go over.
No, I'm here to engage with your questions and so forth.
Okay. Well, how about this? How do you think that conversation went with Andrea, and how do you think it could maybe be improved the next time?
Um, I mean, it's hard for me, because I've got to do all my thinking to try to respond, and I'm not reflecting. Um, I thought she was being defensive, and she probably thought I was being defensive. Um, and what might be able to be done to um, help solve that is you taking a more active role, maybe, to try to get the issues discussed kind of one at a time, instead of, I thought we were always discussing several big complexes of things all at once, round and around, instead of drilling down on one point.
Right.
But no, I mean, we were never going to see eye to eye about anything. The real question is, did listeners get a sense of what the fundamental issues and divisions are? I'm not sure.
Well, I know that's often what people say when they're in a debate, but my hope is the people involved actually eventually, if there's multiple conversations, can start to see eye to eye. I mean, there's one thing. It's like if if her opinion is that any government, if the government does something by force, then that's necessarily bad. I don't know if you can ever like change her mind on that, because I'm more of a utilitarian. So it's like whatever the end result is, I think that's most important. But I think usually if we're talking about what the facts are, and I think it's easier to come to more like of an agreement, or I think it's possible at least.
Yeah, I think on a number of the issues we could have gotten, pursuing things a little bit more, we could have gotten agreement on the factual issues. There was a lot of agreement about factual issues. So once we cleared away a lot of that, then we were discussing other things, and I'm not really satisfied with, her answers, because I think that she just didn't want to address this issue that the choices that we face are circumscribed, limited, and that we might make other choices with more alternatives available to us, and that certain things have happened to limit our choices, and we don't have to put up with that. I don't think that was ever really engaged. But I mean, maybe we could do it again or something. But I mean, there's going to be a fundamental difference, because I just don't. I mean, there are fundamental differences that are not fact based here, having to do with what kind of excuse me, what kind of a society you want to have. She and I just don't see eye to eye on that.
Right, but a lot of times those like what type of society she wants is based on certain assumptions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yours might be based on other assumptions. So then you can start drilling into those assumptions and see what's behind that.
Yeah, and at that point we would have to have, I agree with you, but at that point we'd have to have a whole other discussion, um, because there's she has certain libertarian principles that I don't share, and um, those are not assumptions, but those are conclusions based on a whole lot of things. And so we would have to move into a discussion of those other things that have led her to accept that conclusion and me to reject it. So we're no longer talking about the original issue. We've moved back a step. I mean, that's possible.
Well, it might be necessary.
Yeah.
And then
Well, it'd be necessary to try to move beyond an impasse whereby you got people, or one embracing certain principles and one rejecting them. I mean, principles can be talked about, but yeah, if we want to move beyond the impasse, it would be necessary. I don't know that that's going to happen.
I don't know either. But, for example, she's got, I think she's got some fears. Like you think we should do some things differently, and she's worried that how we approach things differently might turn into, like Maoist China or something like that, right?
Yeah, I mean that's like the Jordan Peterson kind of line. And I know that she wasn't invoking human nature, but I think the source of that fear is generally, it's not nice to fool Mother Nature that there's a natural order of things, and if you disturb it, you just make things worse. The fact of the matter is certain choices were made in the USSR, Mao's China, and so forth. Things could have gone differently. What happened is certainly not an inevitable consequence of people wanting to change society for the better, or even in the socialist direction. These were, the Russian Revolution turned into a Stalinist counter-revolution, and so forth and so on. And Mao was a Stalinist. He was not for libertarian socialism by any means. So, when you get somebody like Jordan Peterson, I'm going to exempt Andrea because she didn't say it, but somebody like Jordan Peterson, he's guilty of a logical fallacy, which is the post hoc ergo propter hoc. Before this, therefore because of this, the cause and effect fallacy. People go into the hospital, then they die. Therefore, the hospital killed them. Well, in some cases it did. Okay, but generally, just because something precedes something else doesn't make it the cause. So what you need to be able to talk about causality is to look at the actual processes that produce a certain outcome. And that I'd never see somebody like Jordan Peterson do. It's always like, you try to struggle for a progressive society, socialism or whatever, and it turns up into Stalinism and totalitarianism. Yeah, like how? And yeah. You don't get an answer. You get basically some sort of appeal to, you've messed with human nature and it blows up in your face. I mean that's not an answer.
Yeah, his approach is definitely very like surface level.
Yeah. But I've heard that my whole life. I mean, he didn't invent that. He just made it popular once again. But why people accept this is I don't know. I mean, a little bit of thought tells you that just this comes before that. You can't just say it's the cause of that, and somebody has to give you a real causal argument about here this caused this and how it did and so forth and so on. And if you don't have that, there's no reason to accept what they're saying.
Right. I think there's a fear that, you try and make decisions as a society, and then that often takes the form of government decisions. And since there are decisions about our whole society, there's a fear that that's necessarily authoritarian.
Yeah, I mean, if it were done within the current setup where we've got, rigged elections, big PACs, dominating the politicians, private property laws, all of this. If you're just to have the government make decisions or to make decisions through a governmental process right now, no, it would not work. I mean, if we're going to make decisions for ourselves as a society, we can't be subject to all these restrictions from the get-go and all these limits on our freedom by other people, owning all the resources and so forth. We really need a new society in which we are able to make decisions for ourselves. Sure. Right. Just trying to make this happen through governmental processes when the government is really not ours is not going to work.
And so you're saying just making the government more democratic isn't enough. We have to make the private sector more democratic as well, or something like that?
Something like that. What I'm saying is that in real senses, politics is the tail and the economic order of society is the dog, rather than the reverse. So if you have a fundamentally violent, monopolized, unfree economic order, the politics are going to follow from that for a lot of simple reasons that we all know. The politicians get paid, they get bought off. The politicians have to think about what's realistic given the economic order of things. And what we need we need deliberation in a situation where we don't start from the premise where all of our choices are constrained and we have to accept the existing order of things, except around the margins.
Here's something that gets brought up a lot. It's the kind of Steven Pinker narrative. That
his most recent book.
The Better Angels.
Right. I haven't read that, but go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I listened to most of the audiobook, but more, you don't really need to to understand what the basic premise is, which is society has been and continues to move in a better direction for most people, right? So one time we had peasantry and stuff like that, and as we've moved away from that, we've moved into a capitalist society. There's been bad things, but generally speaking, most people are better off.
And you would like me to comment?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I haven't read the book. A lot of people have not liked Pinker for a lot of reasons. This book has been criticized a lot, and my guess is that he would be better to stick to what he knows, which is linguistics. But isn't it possible to talk about better in some respects and not better or worse in other respects?
Absolutely.
And if that's the case, then one does not need to respond to the argument that he's making, and one can even question the kind of argument that he's making, which takes everything as a whole and says, are we better off or are we worse off? I mean, unless you can show that all of these things inevitably go together and that, if you want these goodies, you have to accept the consequences of them, and we don't have any leeway. But otherwise, I find it a very constraining kind of argument to say, are we better off or are we worse off? Maybe some things we like and other things we don't like. We like the improved technology. We like the science and scientific method that leads to this. We don't like the profit motive, the monopolization of resources by one section of society against the other. We don't like a political order that is shaped by that economic order. We like the expansion of education. We don't like information being dominated by trolls and by post-truth nonsense. Right? Why can't we be more discriminating?
No, that's perfectly fair. The reason I brought it up is because you had suggested at one point that maybe it's possible it might be better to go back to like a peasant society, right?
I just think that personally, it's not what I would want. But I've lived all my life in the suburbs and in cities. And all I wanted to say is we shouldn't preclude that as a choice that people might want to make, either large groups of people or even potentially, society as a whole. I don't think it's likely. But, there is something that existed in that agrarian society in England prior to the imposition of capitalism, in which people had their own resources and they were able to make a living for themselves without having to do what other people say and following their dictates. That is something good that I would like to be able to recover and to have that again. Can that be done without moving back to an agrarian society? Yeah, but it can't be done in the same way. It can't be done where everybody individually, privately holds their resources, because the resources are now like totally social in nature. You need parts for your equipment and they're being produced, in the Philippines, and other supplies are coming from Brazil and so forth and so on. So we're in this huge interlocked system, totally interdependent on one another. And so if we want to have that kind of situation, decisions need to be made, not all decisions, but some decisions need to be made at the level really of the whole global community. And certainly any solution to the climate crisis is going to, because that affects everybody. What one person does here affects everybody in the globe there and there and there. That can only be solved by grappling with this as a global community. And that's just never going to happen under capitalism.
Well, I agree that problem needs to be solved globally, but there's also the problem, like, when if you try and like solve too many problems at the global level, then there's like the democracy that's practiced in that way is like a really like kind of diminished form, right? Because the people, you have to elect people, a very select people, to make those decisions for the whole world.
Yeah, I agree that, things should be as decentralized as possible, which depends on the particular case, but not more than is possible. And, I'm saying possible while it still provides effective solutions to things. So in the case of the climate crisis, you could try to solve it in a decentralized manner, but it's not going to work. But yeah, it depends on the individual case, I think. But the real problem, I think, is not so much representative democracy versus participatory democracy. That seems to be a big problem because we have representatives that can pursue their own self-interest, which is not those of their constituents. But that's fundamentally due to the nature of capitalist society, that the gigantic corporations and so forth. Other capitalist countries, can buy them off, turn them into puppets, and so forth. If we have a society in which the interests of one are not antagonistic to the interests of others, then I think the issue of representation and I just think it becomes less of a problem.
Right, like when there's not one class holding all the resources and then
right, and owning certain politicians or just politicians being out for themselves, right, rather than their constituents. If we have a society in which we don't have to agree, but we all have common interests, and we recognize that, then a lot of our social problems can be overcome. And so there can be a mix of participation, representation, and so forth. I'm not saying it has to be, right? But I'm saying I think it's certainly possible.
So
this is what always surprises and rather bothers me about people with a libertarian orientation is they're very concerned about government compulsion and state violence, whereas I don't see anywhere near similar concern for the economic coercion that people with a lot of economic resources and power impose, and their violence and coercion. And I trying to be charitable, I don't understand it. I mean, there are non-charitable explanations that make sense of it, but if I'm trying to be charitable, it just seems like, why are you just focused on this one thing and not the others? And I mean, the answer she gives and the answer they always give is, well, what's the alternative? I mean, but hello, that's not an answer to the question of why you're not concerned. That's a different question. That's a different question.
Right.
I mean, if you're concerned, then we can discuss and you can explore alternatives. We don't demanding a worked out alternative from somebody else and then trying to pick at it is not the way you go about things if you're truly trying to overcome a problem.
Right. You can address it. You can address that itself first, and then you can move on to talking about alternatives.
Sure. I mean, but see, I mean, that would be a tremendous leap forward to not just say there's imperfections and we can do better, but to say that in addition to coercion, violence, economic power coming from the state over people, we have something not that dissimilar when it comes to those with economic resources and power who exercise violence and so forth. I mean, just to get that admission would put the discussion on a whole other basis that is more, it seems to me like less special pleading. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's fair. So when I think about an alternative, it always seems to come to like some sort of cooperative run, like factories and things like that. Does that come to your mind when you like think about an alternative?
Well, yeah, partly because there's the history of that, but I've written actually a lot about this, and I don't think that the principal issues are those of organizational form. In other words, who controls production, workers' committees in the workplace, or federation of workers' committees. There's a bigger set of issues which have to do with, although those are not unimportant things, but they don't settle the issue. Making decisions does not settle the issue, because an economy is a network of relations and a system. And it doesn't work just by, okay, here we decide to do it and we implement the decision and it happens. A lot of things don't happen like that. There are unintended consequences. So, there's a certain so-called logic to an economy, a certain logic to capitalism. You have to break with that logic of capitalism, driven by profitability and all of that. You have to have different principles by which things are going to operate. Because let's say you've got workers' committees in factories and they own the means of production and everything. If they're still in a competitive environment and competing against other workplaces, and they try to improve their working conditions and have less work, so they're working 30 hours a week rather than 40, the only way they can keep going is if they raise the prices of their products, because they're not going to be as productive as the competitors, and the consumers are going to not want to pay the higher prices, so they're going to go out of business. So that's part of what I'm saying about this total logic of the system. It's not just a matter of who decides and having good ideas and trying to implement them. You have to have a system where the parts mesh and there's a logic that coheres, instead of you try to do things that just run up against that fundamental logic. And that is a set of issues that is just under-discussed and underappreciated, because people, especially on the left, have come to think of the questions as, who decides, what are our priorities, and if we had power, everything would be hunky-dory. We'd have the power, we'd have different priorities, we'd make different decisions, and we'd implement them, and then we'd go home. It doesn't work like that.
Cool. Okay, here's what comes to my mind. So you try and move away from that logic, but it seems like it could easily get forced back into that logic, because if one person or collective decides they want to make something cheaper, then that kind of drives, then other people might just decide to get that because it's cheaper, instead of going to the people who have better work conditions. How do you go against that type of logic?
Well, yeah, you say, what compels this? First of all, what is compelling people to go for what's cheapest rather than what's not cheapest? Well, it's the limits on their resources, so they want to use their money, their income as wisely as possible, get the most for their money. I mean, we know that. You're going to change that? Well, yeah, if you had a society of complete abundance, but we don't have that. Okay, so we have to work out how to grapple with this problem before we have a society of complete abundance. And so, what's the fundamental logic on the producer side? What's compelling this? Well, it's the system of competition that enforces it, right? I mean, that was part of the account. Is you've got competitors, and so you have to try to meet the needs of the consumers as best you can, and that means produce as cheaply as possible. You get rid of that competition, you can get rid of the problem.
What do you mean?
How do you get rid of the competition? Okay, then you got questions, but it's not turtles all the way down. Right? You got the competition because you have many units of capital, right? Or many companies striving for profit. You have to get rid of the system in which people are producing, in accordance with their drive for individual profit. If we have a cooperative society where we together own and control the means of production, we don't need that competition. I'm not saying competition is bad. I mean, right? There's all kinds of competition. I mean, there's competition to, build a better mousetrap, to, discover something first. And I'm not saying there's something fundamentally wrong with competition, but I'm saying that this way of producing, where it's one's interest against others' interests, that's fundamentally flawed. It's not something about the nature of competition per se.
So would it be like, for example, you want to produce toilet paper or something like that?
Yeah.
And you organize the whole society, and like have one, like you have set number of people producing it at like a set price or something like that, and you.
Okay. So you're getting to the coordination problem in terms of what to produce, how much to produce, and so forth and so on. I think the most successful attempt yet to grapple with these problems from a libertarian kind of socialist orientation is something called participatory economics, or PARICON, which was developed by a couple of people, I think both economists, Michael Albert, who's the editor of Z Magazine, if you've ever heard of that. No. And a co-thinker, Michael Albert and Robin Hanel. So they developed something called participatory economics, or PARICON. And basically, let me see. Have you ever heard of the socialist calculation debate?
No.
No. Okay. So I'm going to try to explain it the harder way. Basically, you don't need to have a planned economy to make this happen, at least in principle. With enough information and enough computing power, you can have algorithms that mesh together the individual desires and choices coming from all across the world. And you don't, it's not provisioned through markets or anything like that. Let me give you an example. Okay, let's say we want coal. Okay, but nobody wants to work in a coal mine because it's horrible and dangerous, life-threatening and so forth. So what happens? What we have is a big demand for coal, but very small supply of coal mining labor, and therefore potentially a very small supply of coal. So all this information gets fed into the computers, and the algorithm says we have a mismatch here. Okay, so what you then do is the computer feeds back a new set of choices and says, well, you want this coal, you're going to have to give up more of other stuff than you originally thought in order to get that coal. So it's just as if the price had gone up, but there are no real prices here. And okay, people don't want to work in the coal mines. Well, maybe they'll be willing to do a little work in the coal mines if, most of the rest of their work is something that they really like. Maybe not. I mean, because that's an extreme example. So what you're able to do by means of an algorithm is and nobody's planning this consciously, but it's just built into the algorithm. You're adjusting the incentives until you eliminate this mismatch between the potential demand and the potential supply. And that's what you need to do to have economic coordination. So it can all be done, without markets, without private property, and without central planning, at least potentially, by means of a central process, but one big gigantic social process, but that is decentralized with people inputting, their preferences and choices, and responding to, what comes out when the algorithm puts this all together and says, well, we still have a lack of coordination here. So it can all work out that way. But it's a gigantic problem because you have so many interlocking things. You know, you got toilet paper, but how do you get the toilet paper? Well, you have to have the paper pulp. You know, you have to have the trees being grown. You have to have the trucks, right? I mean, so it's a big issue. But all those issues are fundamentally just technical, a matter of matching the potential supplies and the potential demands, and changing the incentives until that happens. And you don't need to have prices and markets and private property to make that happen, at least in principle.
And you take track of all those like demands, like when people go to the store or whatever would be in place.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing. Yeah.
So this algorithm, like the inputs would be like someone goes to the store and buys toilet paper, and that would just go into like it would be like part of the input for the algorithm. Right?
Well, no, because you have to. This is a question of planning ahead. Okay, so it's not a question of. I mean, although you would need to do that as well, you need to evaluate how well this worked. But you plan ahead and you go, okay, well, people have expressed a desire for X amount of toilet paper, you know,
right, but
in this region or throughout the world. Okay, but
how do they express that desire? That's I guess what.
How would they express the desire? Well, they would, you know, once a year or whatever, they would say, you know, there'd be lists provided, you know, tell us how much you want of this, that, and the other. Could be done more frequently, but most people don't like filling out, you know, lists. So I mean, I wouldn't want to do it more frequently, but you would say, you know, well, we use about 2 rolls a month, 12 months, so we need 2 dozen rolls of toilet paper.
Yeah,
you know, and obviously, you know, whoever's overseeing this process can have some idea of totally what the total social need based on past experience. Sure. But yeah, individuals would have to input their consumption preferences and their preferences regarding work and so forth, and they would have to be responsive to the feedback that they receive from the algorithmic system, you know, and change what they're trying to get and what they're willing to do accordingly.
So that strikes me as a less dynamic system than the one we currently have. Would you agree?
It doesn't operate as quickly.
Right.
For example, you know, you would have this happen like once a year or something. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not saying like that's the biggest flaw in the world necessarily, right? Because I might decide like I need tape for something right now, and I go to the store and I get tape. But I mean, how much do I really need that tape? Like, I don't necessarily need it as immediate. But
yeah, I mean, this is one of the criticisms. The guy says, well, you know, the socialist philosopher, you know, he says against this, you know, like every once in a while I want to fry a piece of bacon, you know, and like I didn't put that on my list at the beginning of the year. Does that mean I can't get a piece of bacon? I'm like, this is not a gigantic social problem. I'm sorry.
Right.
You know, I mean, we have such severe social problems that his desire to eat a piece of bacon now and then on a whim, I mean, my view is, look, get over it. You know, this is you can't have everything, and I don't think people need to be so protective of what they want to do on a whim.
Right. Still, I think a lot of people would be nervous how this would like play out because it is kind of experimental, right?
I mean, in a certain sense. I mean, but they're thought experiments. The only okay, let me break it down. I think the computing power is sufficient. The global networks are sufficient to convey the information. How feasible would it be to construct algorithms that iteratively reach the solution, which eliminates the imbalances between potential supply and potential demand? I don't think that those obstacles are severe. So, we can break it down a bit. But thought experiments like that are not they're not a complete substitute for actual lived experience. But I'm not seriously concerned that the whole thing would just blow up. There are problems, but I mean, a lot of the problems are of this nature of, people wanting tape or wanting a piece of bacon or something like that.
Right, but it's just so less dynamic that I'm thinking that maybe those are the examples we can think of, right? That it's shortcomings, but maybe there are other shortcomings that are just a little harder to anticipate, and so I wish it could play out, on a smaller scale.
That's interesting. I mean, one can do experiments. I mean, it wouldn't be that hard with but I mean, I think that you're really talking about is actually running a society in which this is how things are coordinated and what would be the unanticipated and unintended consequences of a whole society operating like this, not just would this part of it operate in an efficient manner, right? You're talking about, what kind of society would we have, right? Yeah, I mean, that you really can't experiment so easily with, but right. I mean, look, I think that we've reached pretty much the end with this climate crisis. The way we're going right now, with all the misgivings and apprehension about alternatives that we don't know about, it seems to me that we don't have that much time left, and we've got to be audacious and face down our fears and say, we have to do something here. Because what we have, we know is not working for most of us.
Well, I mean, if the question is climate, I think the main problem is political, right? It's that, for example, in the U.S., one party doesn't want to do anything, and there's enough people in America that have been convinced of that perspective.
Well, I think the main problem is economic. The problem is we have a system in which individual companies, individual countries are, trying to get advantages for themselves without regard to anybody else. It's being driven by individual self-interest, specifically the quest for profit. That's the fundamental problem.
Right. Okay? Yeah.
Rather than decisions about how much to produce, what to produce, being done by the society as a whole with regard to what is good for society as a whole. So, look, the situation in the U.S. is absolutely, terrible with the political problem, but you also have countries that are trying to grow rather rapidly, China, India, and they're saying, look, we're behind, okay? We're trying to catch up. We're going to use coal, Okay, we're going to do this and that. We're not going to follow the accords unless you guys make sacrifices. So it's not just a U.S. problem by any means.
Right.
So from their standpoint of individual self-interest of their capitalist country, whether it's China, whether it's India, what they're doing makes sense. What the capitalists are doing in the United States makes sense from their perspective. This is all according to Andrea's dreams. People face the situation and they make the best choices for themselves. And who's to say it's not good for themselves and others? Well, the consequences are we are severely damaging the environment for our species, other species, maybe irrevocably. That's the answer.
Right, but what I was saying when I said the problem's political is because, at least in our country, if we put, for example, something like a carbon tax in place and then subsidies in the right place and, offset that carbon tax so it's not like, because it is a regressive tax. So like, I think if that was put in place, it would have to be like offset by some other programs. So like, like the poor aren't hit as hard, and the working class isn't hit as hard by, like having to pay more for gasoline and stuff like that. But I think like technically you make some like simple changes to like how the economy works, and then all of a sudden we're moving in the right direction. But there is the political problem behind that.
There's a political problem, but I mean, you're in California. The state of California has some economic power, and it tries to impose standards that are, surpass the federal ones. And what is happening? The companies are fighting that. So it's not just political, although it's being fought out in the realm of politics. There are economic interests here. And the economic interests are part and parcel of what capitalism is. We want to get the most profit for our shareholders. That's not some flaw that's correctable within capitalism. That's a feature, not a bug. That's what we got to get across. That's a feature. It's not a bug. It's the features that are killing us.
Right. I understand that. That's the economic interest is driving them to fight the political changes, and it's also corrupting the political system. So yeah, I understand that, but it's still technically possible if you could convince all of America to get on the same page to override that. I think they're able to thrive when there's enough people in America who aren't on board with climate change action, that like the companies are basically to have their way as long as there's uncertainty, there's confusion, and maybe that's, I know some people say that that's just the system, right? It's so corrupted that it's always going to be hard to win that battle.
Yeah, it's going to be hard. Is it possible to, curtail these companies and so forth by political means? It's worth doing. But again, here in this case, and you recognize as well as I do, there's no nation-based solution to the climate crisis. It has to be international, and you've got countries with huge populations, much bigger than this country, and they're saying, look, you got yours. You have a relatively small population. You use up so much of non-renewable resources. We don't. We're just trying to improve our economic standard of living and whatnot. And I'm not saying these are great countries, but that's the line they give. Don't stand in our way and make us have to, do things when you're not like making sacrifices yourselves commensurate to, how much of this problem you're causing. It has to be global, and we don't have anything right now like global decision-making institutions that have any power whatsoever.
Right. Well, I mean, one thing we could do if we are really on board is the wealthier countries could, help subsidize, like poorer and countries that are like industrializing right now. They could subsidize their switch to a more green approach and make it worth it, right?
Right. But we live. Look, but see, we live in a. This goes to these issues of the logic of the system once more. Despite the fact that we're better off, tens of millions of people in this country are not that well off. And how are you going to provide for these other countries? Well, you tax the population here. People don't want that. It's not hard to understand why they don't want it. I mean, they might want it to a limited degree, but, charity begins at home, right? So you run up against not just human nature and ill will and so forth. I mean, there's an objective fact, which is that even in the developed world, capitalism does not provide excess, plenty for the majority of the population, such that they can willingly, share without consequences. And it's not because it couldn't. It's because if it did, like we were saying before, if people had what they needed to live without doing other people's bidding, then they wouldn't do that, and the whole system would come crashing down. Okay, so everything goes up against this logic of capitalism. And that's what's got to be overcome. We have to run our lives, society, on entirely different principles. Once we do, the climate crisis is at least conceivably ameliorable, right? We can remedy the situation once we, at least, perhaps, once we're operating according to a different logic and different principles. But I just don't see it at all under capitalism. I mean, capitalism has brought us to this. It keeps us mired in it, and without any solution, and the problem just keeps getting worse and worse.
Yeah.
And again, it's a feature, not a bug, right?
Yeah. I mean, I take all your objections to that. Those are all fair. I just don't know if there can be like fundamental shift in everything. I don't know. One, I'm not fully convinced that that's the right move, and two, I'm not fully convinced that that's the best bet for something that's going to actually happen. Like, right?
And what do you mean by that? What is that reference to? I'm not sure that is right.
Yeah, I mean, this is an impending problem. It's coming quickly. I don't know if you're gonna get enough people to be for like a fundamental shift in society in time.
Right. I agree with you. It's very, very dicey.
And so it's like
it's really tragic, and we've got a government now that denies the whole problem and just says stupid, so yeah, everything keeps getting worse. And no, I mean, people haven't woken up to, we have to just say halt and do something completely different. And the logic of this system is literally killing us, endangering, life on this planet. We haven't even very progressive people haven't really thought through the problem and posed it in that sense and said, enough is enough. Let's reevaluate everything from the ground up. Yeah, it's a very, very dicey situation.
Yeah, I think that's why I would put my money on the other approach, which is even if there's all sorts of fundamental problems with it, I would still try a carbon tax in America and try and work with other countries and just do what we can in the system we can as much as possible, move in that direction.
I don't know enough of the science to know whether, let's say it works as best as it can, whether that would be sufficient to stop harm that cannot be reversed. And that's the real question. The real question is, is what can be done in a country like the US on a national level, or what the various countries of the world are ready to commit to and actually implement from the Kyoto stuff, these piecemeal partial solutions, are they enough to prevent things from getting worse and irreversibly so? I just don't know. I really wish we had here somebody who does know the answers.
Yeah, I mean, it may not work, and we'll see what happens. But I'm just saying, I think I think they're both kind of unlikely solutions. It's probably we're just gonna keep just moving in the same direction, and we're gonna be hit by climate change in a bad way. But if I were to bet on one solution, that's all I'm saying.
If you were to, just repeat.
If I was to bet on one solution, it would be
action at the national level.
At the national level and international level, but just in the same capitalist system we have,
Yeah. You would bet that would be the most likely to be pulled off.
Correct.
But neither you nor I really know whether what can be done realistically within that framework, in the best case, overcoming the opposition of this and that and the other thing, is anywhere near to what is needed to solve the problem from becoming absolutely catastrophic. That's the problem.
Correct. Or in the best case scenario, it is enough. But in the realistic or optimistic scenario, we don't know that it's enough. That's what I would say.
Right. And the best case scenario is where all the nations of the world, I think you mean is they all come to an agreement that we're going to do things totally differently, even if it's not in our individual economic self-interest.
Right.
Right. Yeah. That's the best case. I think that's actually the case that's needed, and I can tell you that is just not going to occur.
Right. And so I think the more optimistic case is something less than that, something better than we have now. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, we have real factual issues that we just don't know the answer to. I'm very skeptical because of what I have heard, about the magnitude of the reorientation that's needed. But I don't like to speak where I don't really have deep and intimate knowledge about what I'm talking about. So secondhand opinions from me don't count.
Fair enough. Okay. Well, we can probably wrap it up here.
Right.